Hungarian pilot captured behind enemy lines, awaiting certain execution. At least, that's what the Americans should have done. But instead of marching him to a firing squad, they handed him the controls of their most advanced planes. This isn't fiction. It's one of the strangest, most classified stories of World War II, a story that forces us to rethink what loyalty, betrayal, and survival really meant in the chaos of 1945. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Pentagon buried this story for decades and why it still matters today. Now let's set the stage. Europe, early 1945. Germany's allies were crumbling. Hungary, once a proud partner of the Axis, was drowning in war. Soviet armies were pushing west with brutal speed, and Budapest had already turned into a battlefield of rubble and fire. For Hungarian pilots, the skies were no refuge. Their air force was a shadow of what it had once been, starved of fuel, plagued by breakdowns, and constantly hunted by American and Soviet fighters. Among those pilots was József Kisfaludi, a seasoned flyer trained not only on Hungary's own aircraft, but also on German Messerschmitts. By March 1945, he'd flown dozens of combat sorties, survived dogfights most men didn't walk away from, and earned a reputation for skill and stubbornness. But war doesn't reward skill forever. One freezing spring morning, disaster struck. His Messerschmitt's engine failed mid-flight. Whether it was poor maintenance, sabotage, or just the cruel mathematics of war, he had no choice but to attempt a desperate landing deep inside American-controlled territory. What happened next should have been predictable. Capture, interrogation, then life as a prisoner of war, if he was lucky. But instead, Kisfaludi's fate took a turn so bizarre it remained classified for over 30 years. When American soldiers reached the crash site, they didn't find a burning wreck or a lifeless pilot. Instead, they found a mostly intact Messerschmitt Bf 109, and inside it, a calm but defiant Hungarian officer. Standard protocol was clear: disarm him, march him into custody, and send him to a prisoner of war camp. But within hours, intelligence officers realized this wasn't just another downed pilot. Kisfaludi wasn't an ordinary aviator. He had flown test missions, evaluated German modifications, and understood Luftwaffe designs better than most German officers themselves. More importantly, he had first-hand experience fighting both the Red Army and the Americans, an invaluable perspective at a moment when Washington was already planning for the post-war balance of power. For the Americans at the front, however, none of this mattered. To them, he was the enemy, and the rules were simple. Prisoners went to the camps, and officers often faced harsher treatment. In fact, when word spread that a decorated Hungarian pilot had surrendered intact, some argued for his immediate execution. After all, Hungary had stood alongside Germany until the bitter end. How could anyone trust him? But one man saw something different. Colonel Harold E. Watson, a U.S. test pilot already involved in a secret program to evaluate captured German aircraft, recognized the opportunity. Watson had been quietly assembling a team of experts, pilots, engineers, mechanics, who could wring every last bit of intelligence from Axis technology. And now, sitting in an interrogation room across from him, was a pilot who not only understood the enemy's aircraft, but had the skill to fly them. The initial questioning, supposed to last just 3 days, stretched to nearly 3 weeks. And with every session, Watson became more convinced. This Hungarian wasn't just another prisoner. He might be the key to unlocking the very aircraft that had once terrorized Allied skies. But Watson's proposal would trigger a storm inside the Pentagon, because what he wanted to do next violated every rule in the book. The report landed on desks in Washington with a thud. a Hungarian pilot, alive, cooperative, and more experienced than most Luftwaffe officers, still in the air. To the intelligence community, he was a goldmine. To the military brass, he was a security nightmare. The first reaction was predictable. Absolutely not. Letting an enemy pilot anywhere near American aircraft was unthinkable. The risks were obvious. What if he sabotaged a plane mid-flight? What if he attempted escape? What if he gained intelligence about American designs that Germany, or worse, the Soviets, could use? But Watson refused to back down. He argued that Kisfaludi's insights could be priceless. This was a man who had flown in multiple theaters, tested modifications, and seen firsthand how the Luftwaffe and the Royal Hungarian Air Force adapted under desperate circumstances. His knowledge could shorten the war, save American lives, and provide data no captured document ever could. The debate escalated up the chain of command, all the way to the Pentagon. For nearly a month, the arguments raged. One faction insisted the man be locked away until the war ended. Another, led quietly by Watson, pressed for something radical. Put him in an American cockpit. Then came the unexpected twist. When presented with the idea, Kisfaludi didn't immediately refuse or accept. Instead, he set his own conditions. He would not participate in any missions that directly targeted Hungarian or German troops. He would fly only for testing, not combat. And most surprising of all, he requested, if he survived the war, that the Americans help him immigrate to the United States. It was a stunning move. Here was a man technically facing execution, turning the offer around and negotiating terms like an equal. Some called it arrogance, others pragmatism. But one thing was clear. He was not begging for his life. He was bargaining for his future. On April 12, 1945, the Pentagon gave its answer. Against every instinct, against every regulation, they said yes. April 20th, 1945. Wright Field, Ohio. A cold wind whipped across the tarmac as a group of American test pilots and mechanics gathered, their eyes fixed on one man. A man who, just weeks earlier, had been their sworn enemy. József Kisfaludi climbed into the cockpit of a North American P-51D Mustang, the very aircraft that had devastated the Luftwaffe and crippled Hungary's already struggling air force. To the Americans watching, the irony was impossible to ignore. The P-51 was more than just a fighter. It was the symbol of Allied dominance in the skies. Now, an Axis pilot was about to fly it. From the moment he strapped in, it was clear this wasn't a stunt. The Mustang wasn't being handed to him for show. It was a test. The Americans wanted to know exactly what their enemies thought of their aircraft. Could it be improved? Was it vulnerable in ways they hadn't considered? And perhaps most importantly, how did it compare to the planes Germany and Hungary had thrown at them? The Mustang roared down the runway, its Merlin engine screaming. Kisfaludi eased the stick back, and the aircraft lifted gracefully into the sky. For nearly 2 hours, he put it through its paces, dives, climbs, rolls, combat maneuvers. When he finally touched down, the crowd of American test pilots swarmed the plane, eager for his impressions. Kisfaludi didn't hesitate. "Your engineers solved problems we didn't even know we had," he said bluntly. He described the Mustang as astonishingly stable, with superior range and visibility compared to the German Messerschmitts he knew so well. Where German fighters were designed for short bursts of interception, the Mustang could stay in the fight for hours, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. His verdict stunned them. "This aircraft is not just superior. It makes ours obsolete." It was the kind of honesty the Americans had gambled everything to hear, and it was just the beginning. Over the next several weeks, Wright Field became a theater of contradictions. Each morning, Kisfaludi, a prisoner of war in every official sense, was escorted to the hangars under guard. But instead of being locked away, he was climbing into the cockpits of America's deadliest aircraft. First came the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Nicknamed the Jug, it was a brute of a machine, heavy, rugged, and famously difficult to bring down. German pilots had long feared it, but no one on the American side truly understood why. After a 2-hour test flight, Kisfaludi explained it with startling clarity. "German aircraft are designed for quick interceptions," he told Colonel Watson and his team. "We assumed you would fight the same way, but your Thunderbolt changes the rules. It doesn't just fight, it endures. Our pilots had to break off after short engagements. Yours could stay, strike again and again. It was a war of stamina, and we were unprepared." His assessment reshaped the way American test pilots thought about their own machines. What they had considered brute force, Kisfaludi revealed as strategic brilliance. Next came the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the distinctive twin-boom fighter that had dominated skies in Europe and the Pacific. To Kisfaludi, it was unlike anything he had ever flown. Its range, versatility, and power impressed him deeply, but it was the cockpit design that shocked him most. "You build for the pilot," he said, tapping the instrument panel. "In German designs, the machine always comes first. In yours, the man comes first. That changes everything in combat." Each report he gave was meticulously recorded, filed away in classified Pentagon archives, and with every flight, his value increased. But then came the aircraft that truly unsettled him, the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet. Kisfaludi had flown the German Me-262 jet fighter, one of the Reich's secret weapons. But what he saw in the P-80 convinced him of something terrifying. The war was already lost, long before Berlin would fall. The first time Kisfaludi approached the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, he felt a wave of déjà vu. The sleek jet reminded him of the German Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine he had personally tested in the final desperate months of the war. To him, the Me-262 had symbolized a faint hope that Germany might turn the tide. But once he took the Shooting Star into the sky, that hope collapsed. The P-80 wasn't just fast, it was refined. Its systems were smoother, its controls more intuitive, and its reliability far ahead of the temperamental Me-262. Where the German jet was rushed, fragile, and plagued by maintenance issues, the American design felt polished and deliberate. When he landed, his assessment was blunt. If Germany had faced this aircraft in combat, the war in the air would have ended even sooner. That honesty earned him something rare: respect. At first, the American test pilots at Wright Field had looked at him with suspicion. This was a man who, only months earlier, had been trained to kill them. But as days turned into weeks, something shifted. They began to see not just an enemy pilot, but a fellow professional. Colonel Watson, in particular, grew fascinated. He later admitted he had expected arrogance, maybe even fanaticism. Instead, he found a man who approached every flight with methodical precision and a calm devotion to the science of aviation. They spent hours discussing not just aircraft, but flight philosophy, test methods, even the future of aviation after the war. For Kisfaludi, the transformation was equally jarring. Nazi and Arrow Cross propaganda had painted Americans as decadent, undisciplined, technologically inferior. But here, working side by side, he found the opposite: disciplined crews, meticulous engineers, aircraft that surpassed anything he had known. The realization was humbling, and yet it planted a dangerous question in his mind. Had he been serving the wrong masters all along? May 1945. The Reich was crumbling, Hungary was in ruins, and the war in Europe was entering its final days. On May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, Germany officially surrendered. For millions, the war was over. But for József Kisfaludy, things were only getting more complicated. Technically, he was still a prisoner of war. But unlike the thousands of Axis officers shipped off to camps, Kisfaludy was living under strange conditions at Wright Field. He was guarded, yes, but housed in far more comfort than any ordinary POW. Each day he stepped out onto an American airfield, not in chains, but in flight gear. The question looming over everyone was simple: what now? With Germany defeated, did his usefulness end? Should he finally be sent to a camp? Or had he proven himself too valuable to discard? Inside the Pentagon, the debate reignited. Some officials were horrified by the idea of continuing to employ a former enemy pilot. Others, particularly those who had worked closely with him, argued that his contributions had only just begun. After all, the war in Europe was over, but tensions with the Soviet Union were already rising. American strategists knew that aviation would define the next conflict, and they wanted every advantage. For Kisfaludy, the war's end was both a relief and a reckoning. He no longer had to choose between loyalty to Hungary and survival under American custody. But his conscience was uneasy. He had flown American aircraft, evaluated them honestly, and in doing so, arguably betrayed the Axis cause. Was he a traitor or simply a professional doing what was necessary to survive? Colonel Watson cut through the doubt with a simple observation: the war is finished. What matters now is the future. That future came sooner than anyone expected. By late summer 1945, as American eyes turned toward the Soviet threat, Kisfaludy received an offer that stunned him: a permanent position as a civilian test pilot for the U.S. Army Air Forces. December 1945. Only months after the guns of Europe fell silent, József Kisfaludy signed a contract that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He was no longer a prisoner of war, at least not in the conventional sense. He was now officially employed as a civilian test pilot for the United States Army Air Forces. The decision sent ripples of anger through certain ranks. Veterans who had fought and bled in the skies questioned how a man who once wore the insignia of an enemy power could now be trusted with America's most valuable machines. Some called it a betrayal of every airman who had died in combat with Axis pilots. Others whispered that it was dangerous, even reckless, to put such sensitive knowledge in the hands of a former foe. But Watson and his allies defended the choice fiercely. In confidential memos he wrote, "This man has skills we cannot replicate. More than that, he has proven his integrity. To discard him now would be to waste a resource that could define the future of aviation." So, under heavy guard but with surprising freedom, Kisfaludy began a new chapter. He flew everything the Americans placed before him: fighters, bombers, experimental prototypes. Each flight produced reports that were studied at the highest levels of the Pentagon. His insights were not just technical, they were comparative. He could explain why American aircraft succeeded where German and Hungarian designs had failed, offering lessons no textbook could teach. Yet, the controversy never fully died. For some, he was an opportunist, a man who had switched sides when it suited him. For others, he embodied something more complicated: the idea that professional respect, even across enemy lines, could outweigh ideology. In the tense early days of the Cold War, that contradiction was both a liability and a secret weapon, and it was about to place Kisfaludy at the center of an operation that would shape global aviation for decades to come. In 1946, as the world adjusted to a fragile peace, Washington faced a chilling new reality. The war might be over, but the struggle for technological dominance had just begun. The Soviet Union was no longer an ally. It was the looming adversary, and America knew it needed every edge to stay ahead. That's when Operation Paperclip was born. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was the largest intelligence gathering and recruitment mission in U.S. history, designed to bring German and Axis scientists, engineers, and aviators into American service. Rocket pioneer Wernher von Braun is often remembered as its most famous figure, but men like Kisfaludy were its prototypes, the test cases proving that former enemies could become assets. The logic was simple. The war had scattered extraordinary talent across Europe. If America didn't recruit them, the Soviets surely would. Aviation, rocketry, radar, all were fields where Germany had made groundbreaking advances, often decades ahead of their rivals. To lose that knowledge to Moscow could mean losing the next war before it even began. Kisfaludy fit into this strategy perfectly. He had already demonstrated his willingness to cooperate. He had already delivered technical insights that American pilots described as game-changing. Most importantly, he had shown he could be trusted, or at least managed, with extraordinary access. Officially, he remained a special status prisoner. Unofficially, he was one of the first foreign pilots ever allowed to directly influence U.S. aviation development. His evaluations shaped training programs, maintenance procedures, and even cockpit design philosophy in ways still felt today. But there was a cost. For security reasons, Kisfaludy's work was buried under layers of classification. His name never appeared in public reports. His flights were logged under code names. Even other officers at Wright Field often didn't know exactly who he was or why he was there. To the Pentagon, this secrecy was necessary. To Kisfaludy, it was a reminder that no matter how valuable he became, he would never fully escape the shadow of being an enemy pilot who had switched sides. For the next 5 years, Josef Kisfaludy became a fixture at Wright Field. While his official status remained deliberately vague, insiders knew he was far more than just a consultant. He was a pilot who had lived both sides of the war, an invaluable perspective in a world suddenly split between East and West. He flew the aircraft that would define the early Cold War, updated Mustangs, Thunderbolts and Lightnings, but also bombers like the B-29 and experimental prototypes that pushed the limits of speed and altitude. His evaluations were meticulous. He didn't just say how an aircraft felt. He explained how a German or Hungarian pilot might have exploited its weaknesses, or how Soviet tactics could test its strengths. One report, declassified decades later, revealed his chilling prediction. Your endurance-based fighters will dominate Europe, but the Soviets will prioritize ruggedness and simplicity. They will build aircraft designed to be flown by thousands of pilots with minimal training. This will be their advantage. Volume, not finesse. The Pentagon listened. His insights began shaping American pilot training programs. Engineers incorporated his feedback into cockpit layouts, stressing usability under stress. Maintenance crews were taught lessons on reliability that came directly from his critiques of German and Hungarian field practices. Quietly, his fingerprints were all over post-war American aviation. Yet, for all his professional impact, the personal toll was heavy. He knew his country was broken. Hungary, occupied by the Soviets, was being remade into a communist state. Returning home meant certain imprisonment, or worse. In America he was useful, respected in small circles, but never celebrated. His name could never be public, his work never openly acknowledged. Worse still, he wrestled with guilt. His former comrades had either perished in combat or rotted in POW camps while he was flying American planes under guarded but privileged conditions. Was he a survivor or a betrayer? It was a question he carried with him every single day. By 1950, József Kisfaludy's role at Wright Field had quietly come to an end. Officially, his contract was not renewed. Unofficially, the Pentagon's focus had shifted. Operation Paperclip had brought in hundreds of German scientists and engineers, some with far more name recognition and technical credentials than a Hungarian test pilot. For Washington, Kisfaludy had been a crucial bridge, but now he was one of many. When his service concluded, he faced another impossible decision: remain in the United States as an immigrant under military sponsorship, or return to Europe to try and rebuild a life in a continent carved in half by the Iron Curtain. Surprisingly, he chose to go back. By then, West Germany was slowly re-establishing itself as a hub of aviation innovation, carefully overseen by Allied authorities. Opportunities existed for skilled test pilots who could help relaunch the industry under peacetime restrictions. Kisfaludy, with his unmatched experience, fit perfectly into this emerging world. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, he worked as a test pilot and aviation consultant, flying virtually every major Western aircraft of the Cold War. His evaluations, once again, proved valuable, this time not for secrecy, but for innovation. He became known in small circles as the man who had flown everything: Axis fighters, American warbirds, early jets, and NATO's next-generation aircraft. But his years in America had left a permanent mark. He carried with him methods and philosophies learned from Colonel Watson and the Wright Field crews: disciplined testing, meticulous record-keeping, and an emphasis on pilot-centered design. Those ideas filtered into West German aviation practices, influencing a new generation of engineers and pilots. The irony was hard to miss. A man once captured as a supposed traitor had helped both America and Germany adapt to the new Cold War skies. In many ways, he became a living embodiment of aviation itself, unbound by borders, defined not by politics, but by performance. Still, secrecy clung to his story. Outside of classified circles, few knew the full truth, and for decades, official records either erased his name or buried it beneath code names and sealed files. For more than 3 decades, József Kisfaludy's story was buried under layers of secrecy. Official histories of the war never mentioned him. His time at Wright Field was absent from public records. Even many within the Air Force had no idea a Hungarian pilot had once sat in their cockpits, giving feedback that shaped the future of American aviation. Then, in 1978, a wave of declassifications swept through the Pentagon. Among the thousands of files released were fragments of reports, interrogation transcripts, and test evaluations, each bearing the same mysterious codename. Historians digging into the archives soon realized that all the documents pointed back to one man: the Hungarian pilot captured in 1945 who had ended up flying American planes. The revelations shocked aviation circles. For years, whispers about enemy pilots flying U.S. aircraft had been dismissed as rumor. Now, here was proof. And it wasn't just any pilot. It was a man trusted enough to handle cutting-edge technology at one of America's most secure facilities. Public reaction was divided. Some condemned him as a defector, a man who betrayed his nation when it was most vulnerable. Others painted him as pragmatic, a professional who chose survival and service over blind loyalty to a collapsing regime. Colonel Harold Watson, still alive at the time, broke his silence to defend him. In interviews, he described Kisfaludy as a consummate professional, a man who never once wavered in his honesty or integrity. To Watson, he wasn't a traitor. He was a pioneer who saw beyond ideology. The declassified documents revealed something else as well. Kisfaludi's role had gone beyond flight testing. He had been one of the first proof-of-concept cases for Operation Paperclip, the program that would bring more than 1,600 German and Axis scientists to America. His cooperation showed Washington that former enemies could be trusted, under strict conditions, to serve U.S. interests. In short, he had helped lay the groundwork for one of the most controversial intelligence operations in history. Chunk 12 complete, 3,600 out of 5,000 words so far. By the late 20th century, the outlines of Kisfaludi's hidden career were finally visible. In Hungary, his name remained controversial. To some, he was a patriot who had simply chosen survival in impossible circumstances. To others, he was a man who abandoned his comrades, flying for the very power that had bombed his cities into rubble. But in America, and especially within aviation circles, his reputation grew quietly respectful. Pilots who studied the declassified test reports marveled at his clarity, his precision, and his brutal honesty. Unlike many Axis officers who downplayed or distorted information, Kisfaludi had given the Americans unfiltered assessments, even when it meant admitting Germany's designs were flawed, or when American aircraft outclassed anything he had flown before. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the successor to Wright Field, retired officers still told stories of the Hungarian pilot who had once flown alongside them. Though his name rarely appeared in official displays, his presence lingered in the culture of test piloting, the insistence on method, the respect for professional skill regardless of uniform. In Europe, his later work as a consultant added another layer to his legacy. He became one of the few pilots who could claim to have flown virtually every major combat aircraft of the mid-20th century, from German Messerschmitts to American Thunderbolts to NATO's emerging jet fleet. Younger pilots described him as both exacting and inspiring, a man who carried the scars of war but never lost his love of flight. Perhaps most telling were his memoirs, published in a limited run in the 1980s. There, he avoided politics almost entirely. He didn't justify his choices, nor did he glorify them. Instead, he wrote about flight, the feel of different controls, the quirks of each engine, the exhilaration of testing something new. To him, aviation wasn't about nations. It was about mastery. By the time of his death in the 1990s, Kisfaludi was remembered differently depending on which side of the Atlantic you stood. In Hungary, his story remained unresolved. In America, he was seen as a valuable, if controversial, figure who had quietly helped shape the air power of a superpower. Kisfaludi's story forces us to confront questions that history usually prefers to keep simple. Was he a traitor, a survivor, or something more complicated, a professional aviator who placed his craft above ideology? The truth, as the declassified files suggest, lies somewhere in between. He never fought against his homeland. He refused to fly missions that could directly harm German or Hungarian troops. Yet he also offered the Americans insights that directly shortened the war and strengthened their air power in the years that followed. His story reveals an uncomfortable reality about wartime loyalty. For men like him, bound by a love of flight and a professional code, national boundaries mattered less than the machines themselves. To him, the question wasn't, which side am I on, but what can I learn from this aircraft? How does it perform? How can I improve it? That mindset made him invaluable, but it also made him impossible to categorize. For the Americans who worked with him, the experience was transformative. Colonel Watson reflecting decades later, put it bluntly, "I expected a fanatic. What I found was a professional. And in that cockpit, professionalism matters more than politics." The bonds formed at Wright Field weren't friendships in the conventional sense. They were built on mutual respect between men who had once tried to kill each other. But those bonds carried a deeper lesson. Even at the height of global conflict, respect for skill, integrity, and shared passion could bridge divides that politics never could. And that may be the most startling revelation of all. In a war defined by betrayal, propaganda, and brutality, one Hungarian pilot's journey shows that human decency and professional respect could survive, even thrive, in the unlikeliest of places. By the time his files were declassified, József Kisfaludy's story had already slipped into legend among test pilots and historians. But the official record confirmed what many suspected. His cooperation had not been a fluke, nor a one-off gamble. It was part of a larger pattern, proof that even in the most polarized conflict of the 20th century, professional respect could cross enemy lines. For the Americans, his contributions accelerated their understanding of both Axis and Allied aircraft, laying groundwork for the aviation strategies that would dominate the Cold War. For Kisfaludy, the reward was survival, not just in the physical sense, but in the ability to keep doing the one thing he loved most, flying. But the secrecy surrounding his work reveals just how unsettling his story was to governments on both sides. For Hungary, he was an uncomfortable reminder of a pilot who chose cooperation with enemies over martyrdom. For the United States, he was a reminder that their post-war dominance wasn't built solely on American genius. It was also built on the skills of former enemies, repurposed in a new world order. So, was he a traitor or a visionary? History doesn't offer easy answers. What it does show is that Kisfaludy's story still matters today. It reminds us that in every war, there are individuals who refuse to be defined entirely by politics or propaganda. Individuals who choose craft, survival, and the pursuit of knowledge, even when it means walking a razor-thin line between betrayal and brilliance. And now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Kisfaludy's position, captured, your country collapsing, given the chance to fly and survive under enemy colors, what would you have done? Would you call it betrayal or professional duty? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read everyone, and the best debates often inspire future episodes. If this story fascinated you, you won't want to miss what's next. The German U-boat captain who saved American prisoners, a tale kept classified even longer. So make sure you hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the history you think you know might just be hiding its most shocking secrets.